In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. God was in the beginning, and through God all things were made. And from the throne of God poured the music. And all of God's creation reveled in the music, because it was always changing and always getting better. And one day God said, let's make someone like us, someone who can breathe, someone who can think, someone who can feel, and someone who can love, someone we can make music with. And so God set out to create the greatest masterpiece yet, human beings. And God set them in a garden and said, here are your strings. We can make music together, music such as the world has never heard before. But there's one thing. See that tree in the center of the garden? Don't mess with that tree, because if you do, your strings will corrode and you won't be able to make music anymore. I must leave you for a little while, but I'll be back to teach you how to play the music. And so God left Adam and Eve in the garden that had been created for them. And they got to know the garden and each other and the strings really well. And one day, Eve was taking a walk through the south end of the garden. And all of a sudden she hears, hey, come here. I see you've been eating off all the other trees in the garden except mine. How come? Well, God says we're not supposed to eat off that tree, because if we do, our strings will corrode and we won't be able to make music with God anymore. And the snake said, no, don't you see? It's just a trick. Wouldn't it be nice to make music whenever you wanted and not wait for God to come around? See, God just wants to keep all the good music so nobody else can have it. See, it's all just a test. And Eve said, no, my strings are in such perfect tune with God right now. And the snake said, no, wouldn't you like to be able to make music just as much as God does? You'll know as much, just as much as God does, if you eat of the fruit. And so Eve thought about it, and she looked up at the fruit and how good and sweet it looked, and she reached up and she took a bite. And all of a sudden, the strings that had once made such beautiful music began to change. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get the strings, which were once in such perfect tune, to sound like they were supposed to. And Adam came and he ate too, and they were both afraid and ashamed, and they hid. And a little while later, God came back in the garden. Adam and Eve, where are you? Come, let's make music together. Adam and Eve, where are you? We're here, Lord. You've eaten of the tree, haven't you? Don't you see we can't make music together anymore? We're no longer in tune. I must send you away. So God put them out of the garden, out of the perfect place that had been prepared for them. And as they were leaving, God said, I can fix this, but you have no idea how much it's going to cost. And after they left the garden, they forgot about God's music and what it sounded like. They had children, and they had children, and they had children, and people just got worse and worse and worse, and humans began to totally disregard all God's music, and people kept getting worse and worse and worse, and then one day God said, it's time. And so, in a little town called Bethlehem, a new melody was heard. And it was the same melody that had brought the earth into being the music. He walked through the country and played the music that the world had been waiting so long to hear. And in his travels, he came upon many different kinds of people. One day, he came upon a rich man. And that rich man had all the best strings that money could buy. A big, pompous rich man. And when he heard Jesus, he said, "Hey, how can I play like that?" And Jesus said, "My friend, the problem's not in the music. The problem's in the strings. You need a new set of strings." And the rich man said, "Well, give me a set." And Jesus said, "You can't put two sets of strings on the same instrument. You must cut yours first. And if you cut your strings, you can receive a new set." But the rich man thought about it as he strummed his strings quietly. And he thought about how rich his strings were and how much money they had cost him. And he walked away sadly. He missed the chance of a lifetime. And Jesus kept playing the music. And he gave away many, many new sets of strings. And the people, they loved his music. And one day, Jesus came upon a blind man. And this blind man tried so hard to play the music, but he never could. He tried so hard. And when he heard Jesus play, he said, "Hey, how can you play like that?" And Jesus said, "My friend, the problem's not in the music. The problem's in the strings." And the blind man said, "Well, give me a set." And Jesus said, "You can't put two sets of strings on the same instrument. You must cut yours first. And if you cut your strings, you can receive mine." And the blind man strummed his strings for a moment, and he said, "But then I won't sound like the rest of the guys anymore. I won't sound the same. I'll sound like you." And Jesus said, "I've come to bring the music and all of its fullness." And the more the blind man thought about it, the more he realized the real blindness he had. And so he cut his strings. And he got a new set. And all of a sudden, his music began to change. And he began to hear things and see things that he never had before. And he knew his strings were never going to die. And he knew he could play his music forever and ever. And Jesus went on giving new sets of strings and playing his music. And he was getting very popular with the people. Except for the religious leaders of Jerusalem. And they got together and they had a meeting and they said, "This Jesus fellow, he's getting way too popular. There are too many people following him. Either we're going to have to follow him too, or we'll just take him outside the city and we'll cut his strings." And one day, they took the man, the only man that had ever lived, that really knew how to play the music. And they took him outside the city and they cut his strings. And as they nailed the nails in his hands, his music got softer and softer, and he tried to play so hard for as long as he could. But finally, his strings fell silent. And the Pharisees couldn't stand the silence because it accused them in all of its loudness. So they went down to the Jerusalem tavern and they had a little party. And the music was awful. But if you listened to it enough, it begins to sound okay. And if you drink enough, it begins to sound okay. And they were just down there partying away. And all of a sudden, they heard this. do with people like you? They take you outside the city and they cut your strings just like they did Jesus a few weeks ago. So stop playing your music around here, okay? And the little boy looked up at them and said, you thought you cut Jesus' strings, but you didn't. Because his strings are God's eternal strings, and they're never gonna die. You see, he came back about a week ago, and he played music for me, and now I've got a new set of strings. And he's playing his song with me in my life. So if you want to cut my strings, you better hurry up. Because this morning, downtown, Peter, James, and John stood up in the middle of town